Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, we are from group 1. In this video, we would like to explain about experimental research. But before we jump into it, let me introduce you of my group members. The first is Rayhan Aryobimo N, the second is Andriany Suciarahmany, the third is Lukman Hakim, the fourth Ade Nurhabibah, the fifth is me, Cucu Cahyati, and after that we have Syifa Khairunnisa, and at the last we have Mira Fuji S. So without any further ado, let's move to the materials.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Rayhan Aryobimo N. My student's number is 192122097. First of all, thanks for Cucu for letting me to deliver a material about the definition of experimental research. Well, experimental research is a type of research that led with a scientific method with two sets of variables, and the researcher tends to manipulate at least one independent variable and controlling other variables that are relevant. And of course, the researcher perceives dependent variables that could affect the research. The variables are experimental treatment or the independent variable, and the observed variable is dependent variable. And other resource said that experimental research is using a theory of effect of the systemic manipulation of one variable to another. There are 4 designs that can be classified as experimental, pre-experimental, true experimental, quasi-experimental, and last but not least, factorial designs. Thank you. On to the next presenter.
Thank you, Bimo. Now let's move to the characteristics of experimental research that will be delivered by me. Alright, the characteristics of experimental research are: the first one is random assignment. According to Bandari, random assignment is a method of randomly assigning participants from your sample to different treatment groups. With simple random assignment, each member of the sample has an equal chance of being assigned to either the control or experimental groups. The use of random assignment is an important aspect of experimental design. It assists you in ensuring that all groups are comparable at the start of a study. The next one is control of extraneous variable. Variable control is controlling or sorting out the influence of relevant variables. This is done to strengthen the effect given from the independent variable to the dependent variable. The purpose of control in the experiment is to regulate where the influence of manipulated variables on the variable can be controlled. In addition, control in the experiment is also used to eliminate ambiguous explanation of the observed variables. The last one is manipulation of treatment. The manipulation of the independent variable is a deliberate operation performed by the experimenter. In research and other behavioral sciences, the manipulation of independent variables involves setting different treatment conditions. Maybe that's all from me. Thank you, and for the next material will be delivered by Lukman Hakim. Lukman, time is yours.
Thank you very much for the time that has given to me. Here I'm Lukman Hakim. I would like to present the material about measurement of outcomes experimental research. These are 2 variables of experimental research. The first one is independent variable, or we can say that manipulation or treatment variable. Then the next one is dependent variable. Alright. The first step that have do by the experimenter or researcher is determine the dependent variable. Dependent variable, after that, make a treatment, make a manipulation, and then give to the dependent variable, or observed variable, or control variable. After that, we can measure, or the researcher can measure the effect of the manipulation or dependent variable, independent variable to the dependent variable. So the results of experimental research generally is represented by numeric, group, or graphic. It also stated by Ferguson and Henrik in 2011 that the data category appears as a jumble of numbers. On this, we can reduce and simplify them in some way by getting our arms around them and to make them meaningful. And to do this, researchers often turn to the graphical and statistical methods for describing the data. And then here, the example of students writing experimental research. We can say in the green table there is experimental group or as independent variable. Then in the orange table there is control group as the dependent variable. While in here the researcher will measure the effect of student writing method before and after the treatment given by the experimenter. So I think that's all for me. Thank you very much for the time. I give it back, or I give to the next presenter.
Hello everyone, my name is Ade Nurhabibah, and here I will explain about internal validity. Campbell and Stanley 1963 state that internal validity is the basic requirements if one is to draw correct conclusions from an experiment. So internal validity refers to conclusions about whether the observed changes in a dependent variable are actually caused by the independent variable in a particular research of study and not by some extraneous factors. And then there are some traits to internal validity. The first is history. In addition to the experimental treatment, certain events or conditions may occur between the start of the treatment and the post-test assessment. And then causing changes in the dependent variable. History effect is the term used to describe such situations. And then the second is maturation. It refers to changes that may occur in the subject only as a function of the passage of time. And these changes return internal validity because they can produce effects that can be erroneously attributed to the experimental treatment. And the third is testing. The testing effect is when the subject takes the same test at regular intervals, and it can affect their performance regardless of any treatment. And the next is instrumentation. As a result of changes in the instruments used during the study can threaten internal validity. Therefore, the researcher should try to avoid changing the measuring instrument during the research. And the next is statistical regression. It refers to the tendency where a subject who scored very high or even very low on the pre-test to score closer to the mean on the post-test. And the next is selection bias. Selection bias is non-random factor that can affect the selection of subject into the experimental group or control group. It occurs when the researcher cannot assign subject at random but must use whole groups or quasi-experiments, and when volunteers are used. And the next is experimental mortality. Traits occur when there is a difference in the losses of participants from the comparison group. And the next is selection, maturation, integration. If students who mature more quickly are chosen into the experimental group, the selection, maturation, interaction may be mistaken for the effect of the experimental variable. And the next is experimental effect. It refers to the unintentional effect that the researcher has on the research. And the next is subject effect. The attitude of the subjects developed in the response to the research situation that can be true to internal validity. And the last but not least, diffusion. Diffusion occurs when participants in the group or experimental group communicate information about the treatment to the subject in the control group in such a way as to influence the behavior of the latter on the dependent variables. I think that's all from me. Thank you for your attention. And the next material will be presented by Cucu Cahyati.
After all of you know about the internal validity, now let's move to the external validity. What is external validity? As far as I'm concerned from the book of Introduction to Educational Research, External validity is the extent to which you can generalize the finding of study to other situations. It can be people, setting, and measures. Now, there's a question. What are the traits of external validity? Alright, the first we have unsupported place. It's like the limitations of the place. For example, we want to held something. Like when the researchers want to know the ability of students to listening comprehension skill, but in that lab it's not really supported. Like it's the room is not fulfilled with the audio or something like that. So this kinds of thing, it can be become an external validity that influence of to the dependent. The second is situations effect. For example, when we want to have a taste, but the environment is not really conditionally well because there's some noises that could distract the dependence or something like that. These kinds of things also can really influence to the dependence result of the taste. The third is aptitude treatment. Because the selections of the treatment interactions, it can be influence the result. For example, there's interactions between one dependent to another dependent, so they're discussing about what are being tested and try to discuss about the answer, and this kind of thing also can create a dishonest of the result from the research. The fourth we have Hawthorne's effect. For example, there's the tendency of the participant to change their behavior simply because they know they are being, being researched on something. So this kind of thing also can create, a dishonest answer. They try to manipulate the answer. For example, when there's a question whether are you always punctuation when you come to the school. So, because the dependents know that they are being researched, and then they will just answer like, oh yeah, I do. I always come to the classroom punctually, but actually they're not. But they provide a wrong answer, a dishonest answer because they actually know that they are being researched. So this kind of thing also can be an external validity. And then the last we have experimenter effect. For example, actually defendants they know nothing about the research, but there's a queue of the researchers. So this kind of thing also can influence the mindset and also the answers of the dependent.
Hello everyone, I'm Syifa Khairunnisa, and here I will explain about the type of experimental research design. The first one is pre-experimental research design. The pre-experimental research design is further divided into three types. The first one is one-shot case study research design. In this type of experimental study, only one dependent group or variable is considered. The study is carried out after some treatment which was presumed to cause change. The second one is one-group pre-test, post-test researcher design. This research design combines both post-test and pre-test study by carrying out a test on a single group before the treatment is administered and after the treatment is administered, with the former being administered at the beginning of treatment and later at the end. The third is static group comparison. In a static group comparison study, two or more groups are placed under observation where only one of the groups is subject to some treatment while the other groups are held static. All the groups are post-test, and the observed differences between the groups are assumed to be a result of the treatment. And then the second type is quasi-experimental research design. In quasi-experiments, the participants are not randomly assigned, and as such, they are used in settings where randomization is difficult. For example, the time series, non-equivalent control group design, and the counterbalance design. And the last type is true experimental research design. The classification of true experimental research design include: the first is the post-test only control group design. In this design, subjects are randomly selected and assigned to the two groups, and only the experimental group is treated. After close observation, both groups are post-test, and a conclusion is drawn from the difference between these groups. The second one is the pre-test post-test control group design. For this control group design, subjects are randomly assigned to the two groups. Both are presented, but only the experimental group is treated. After close observation, both groups are post-tested to measure the degree of change in each group. And the third or the last is Solomon 4 group design. This is the combination of the pre-test only and the pre-test post-test control groups. In this case, the randomly selected subjects are placed into 4 groups. Alright, I think that's all from me, and the next presenter will be presented by Mira. Thank you.
Alright everyone, the next material is about advantages and disadvantages of experimental research. Here there are advantages and disadvantages according to Miller 2021. The advantages of experimental research: the first, it gives researchers a high level of control. When people conduct experimental research, they can manipulate the variables so they can create a setting that lets them observe the phenomena they want. And then it allows researchers to utilize many variations. This lets them manipulate variables and use as many or as few variations as they want to create an environment where they can test their hypotheses without destroying the validity of the research design. And then it can lead to excellent results. The very nature of experimental research allows researchers to easily understand the relationships between the variables, the subject, and the environment, and identify the causes and effects in whatever phenomena they're studying. And the last, it can be used in different fields. Yes, experimental research can be used in various fields, such as in the medical industry or even in other fields such as chemistry, biology, and etc. And then the disadvantages of experimental research. The first, it can lead to artificial situations. In many scenarios, experimental researchers manipulate variables in an attempt to replicate real-world scenarios to understand the function of drug, gadget, treatments, or other new discoveries. And the second, it can take a lot of time and money. Experimental research can be costly and time-consuming, especially the researcher have to conduct numerous studies to test each variable. And then it can be affected by errors. Just like any kind of research, experimental research isn't always perfect. There might be blunders in the research design or in the methodology, as well as random mistakes they can't be controlled or predicted. And the last, it might not be feasible in some situations. There are times when the variable simply can't be manipulated, or when the researcher needs an impossibly large amount of money to conduct the study. Alright everyone, that's all from me. I give it back to moderator. Thank you.